Okay, so let's take a look at solving by factoring again. I just want to make sure that we have a really good grasp on this concept because it's extremely important to know how to solve by factoring, and it's just factor in general to be able to succeed in future concepts. So let's just take a look at a few more examples. So let's say we had something like this. Let's say we had something like 3x squared is equal to 7x minus 4. Okay, well, the first step in any solving by factoring problem is we need to make sure that we're in standard form. So remember, the standard form of a quadratic equation is ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. A, b, and c are just numbers. Basically what this means is that we need everything on one side of the equation and 0 on the other side of the equation. So we need to move a couple pieces over. So I'm going to subtract 7x and add 4 to each side, and what that gets us is 3x squared minus 7x plus 4 is equal to 0. Okay, and for this one I'll go ahead and take us through the factoring. So remember, we have to find two numbers that multiply to the product of a times c, which in this case is going to be 12, 3 times 4, and add to b, which is negative 7. Well, those two numbers would be negative 3 and negative 4. Okay, remember, it doesn't matter in what order these two numbers are written as long as they're the correct two numbers, because negative 4 times negative 3 gets us a positive 12, and negative 4 plus negative 3 gets us a negative 7. Okay, so now we can go ahead and we can split the middle. So we're going to bring down our first term, bring down our last term, and split the middle using our two numbers, negative 4 and negative 3, attach a variable. And now we're going to factor by grouping, okay? So in this first group, all I'm able to factor out is an x. That's all I can factor out. There's no other common factor. When I factor out an x, I'm going to have x times the quantity of 3x minus 4. And from this next group here, all I can factor out, there really isn't a common factor, but I have a negative term leading, so that means I need to factor out a negative. In this case, I have to factor out a negative 1. And when I factor out a negative 1, that's going to become 3x minus 4. And that's what I need. Remember, we need that common binomial factor. That 3x minus 4 is a common binomial factor, which means I can factor it out. And then the leftovers are x minus 1. So there we got it. We have it factored. 3x minus 4 times x minus 1. So remember, your second step is a factor. We got that. Now our last step is to actually use a zero product property. So remember, that's when we take each factor that has a variable in it and set it equal to 0. So 3x minus 4 has a variable in it, set it equal to 0. X minus 1 is a factor, it has a variable in it, set it equal to 0. And now we solve to get x is equal to 4/3 and x is equal to 1. And that would be our final answer for this problem. All right, let's take a look at one more example. So let's say we had a problem. Let's say 2x squared. Let me go ahead and change the color. 2x squared plus 5x minus 10 is equal to 3x plus 50. So once again, we need to make sure we get everything on one side. So I'm going to subtract 3x from each side. And I'm also going to subtract 50 from each side. So what this is going to become is 2x squared plus 2x minus 60 is equal to 0. And now we have to solve by factoring. But there's one thing that you should always be on the lookout for. Is there a greatest common factor? Like in the previous problem, there was no greatest common factor. I just had to go straight to factoring. But in this case, there actually is a greatest common factor. 2 goes into every single one of these terms. Now, if this was just a factoring problem, we would have to factor out that 2. But since this is an equation and there's two sides, I can actually divide each side by 2. And that's going to make our problem a lot easier, because now this is going to become x squared plus x minus 30 is equal to 0. And this is a much, much more manageable problem. We can factor this very, very quickly. Okay, it would be a little bit more difficult to factor this. If we were factoring from up here, I'd have to find two numbers that multiply to negative 120 and add the 2. However, since I recognize that there's a greatest common factor, instead, I'm finding two numbers that multiply to negative 30 and add the 1, which is way, way easier because those numbers are just 6 and negative 5. And now I can go ahead and factor this, and this would actually factor the x plus 6 times x minus 5. So as you can see, whenever there's a greatest common factor, you always want to try to factor out that greatest common factor. Or if it's an equation, we can just go ahead and divide each side by the greatest common factor, and it's always going to make our life a lot easier because now I go straight to having my two factors. I can set each of these factors equal to 0 by using the zero product property, and I can quickly solve to get x is equal to negative 6 and x is equal to 5. Okay, so make sure that we're practicing with this. In our next video, I'll take a look at, in our next videos, we'll be taking a look at solving quadratic inequalities, as well as, say you're given the final answer, say you're given the solutions, find what the equation would be, okay? So make sure that we're staying tuned for that.